I just want to mention that the presentation tonight is a continuation of what we studied in our last session. And I just want to say that I'm thankful that you're all here. It's very difficult to preach to empty chairs, but it's always good to have people here. So before we get into our study, we want to have a word of prayer to ask the Lord to bless our study together. So I invite you to bow your heads with me as we pray. Father in heaven, we thank you for the privilege of being here once again this evening to open your holy word. We ask, Father, that your Spirit will be with us, that your Spirit will instruct us, and not only instruct us, but also strengthen us to live in harmony with what we are going to study. I thank you for all of these dear folks that have come out. I also thank you for those who are watching the live streaming and those who will watch the DVD presentation and also the presentation on YouTube. We thank you for the promise of your presence because we ask it in the precious name of Jesus. Amen. Probably nothing has been more notorious in the Seventh-day Adventist Church in this struggle during the primary season, the Republican primary season, than the fact that a Seventh-day Adventist is struggling to become the nominee of the Republican Party for President of the United States. You know, just as a matter of information, many of you might not know that Ted Cruz's wife is also a Seventh-day Adventist. And so it's quite interesting that in this election cycle, there are two individuals notorious that are connected or linked somehow to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Now, as I was mentioning, Dr. Ben Carson, a neurosurgeon, renowned, much respected in the world of science and in the world in general, has decided to run for the Republican primary candidacy for President of the United States. He's fallen in the polls recently, but I think he's still in fourth place. Now, our study this evening is not going to be primarily about Ben Carson. What I want to do is set the stage for what we are going to talk about. It just so happens that the mainstream media, as far as I know, has not yet publicized Dr. Ben Carson's views about the end time. But there are individuals and groups that have blogs that have picked up on this. I'd like to mention one of those is an organization called the Young Turks. And they were on television a few years ago, and they also have videos on YouTube. And they've picked up on Ben Carson's views of end time events. And they consider it a conspirational view of history. Also, an individual by the name of David Korn, on October 2, 2015, on his blog on Mother Jones, wrote a very interesting article about the candidacy of Dr. Ben Carson, particularly his views of end-time events. And so as we begin, I would like to read a portion of what David Korn wrote. By the way, David Korn, at least several years ago, was quite frequently interviewed on MSNBC and some other more liberally tended channels here in the United States. But anyway, I'm going to read now from this blog in Mother Jones. Ben Carson, the retired neurosurgeon who's in the top tier of the GOP's 2016 contenders, holds some unusual beliefs. In defending creationism, he has said that Satan is behind the Big Bang Theory and the promotion of evolution. And he, that is Dr. Carson, has embraced and endorsed a paranoid, McCarthy-esque conspiracy theory that claims nefarious Marxists for decades have infiltrated every echelon of American society, including PTAs, in order to destroy the United States. But it seems Carson's conspirational worldview goes beyond all this. In a talk he gave a year ago, Carson, who is a Seventh-day Adventist, indicated that he accepts a dark prophecy rendered a century and a half ago by a founder of his church. She, and we know it's Ellen White, she claimed that as part of the end times, a time will come when Seventh-day Adventists will be imprisoned by the government and even put to death, merely for observing the Sabbath on Saturday, not Sunday. So, does Ben Carson believe that when the big spiritual bang comes, his co-religionists will be rounded up, imprisoned, and executed? Though he frequently cites his faith in God when he speaks publicly and in campaigns, he has not discussed this core tenet of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. But about a year ago, he did refer to it when he was a guest sermonizer at a Seventh-day Adventist church in Australia. Asked to describe the geopolitical landscape of the United States, Carson noted that most people in the United States were afraid to declare their faith. He then continued in the following words, "I don't know what role the Lord has for me in all this. I do know, and looking at prophecy, that the United States will play a big role, that there has to be a return first to a religious awakening, and more than likely, any persecution, particularly of the Sabbath, will come from the right, not from the left." Interesting blog on the Mother Jones website. By the way, you might not have heard of Mother Jones, but it's a very well-known website, very well-known blog, read by tens of thousands of people. So the question that we must ask is, how in the world can Ben Carson be president of the United States and believe that this country will repudiate its Constitution and will persecute those who do not comply with the Sunday law, even to the point of being executed for the observance of the Sabbath? Wouldn't this be considered unpatriotic and even treasonous to the United States? Is there any basis really for such a conspirational view, so-called? Well, the fact is, folks, that we're dealing with a media that is totally oblivious to Scripture. The fact is that the secular media is not able to grasp how things will end because they don't believe in the reliability of the Bible as a historical and trustworthy record. You see, they believe in the evolutionary theory, both in biology and in history. In their minds, the stories of Genesis 1 through 11 never actually took place in history. They are myths or legends, like the ancient Babylonian flood story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, or the ancient Babylonian creation story, Atrahasis. If the stories of Genesis did not really occur, what assurance can we have that they will be repeated again at the end of history? You see, if they didn't happen at the beginning, how can we trust that these same stories will take place again on a global scale at the end of time? You see, the secular media is also oblivious, totally oblivious, to the scenario presented of the end in the book of Revelation. If you ignore or reject the biblical view of the beginning and the end, you are navigating upon an uncharted ocean of uncertainty. So let's see what the Bible has to say about the beginning and the end. That will be our authority. It will not be David Korn. It will not be the media, whether liberal or conservative. It will be God's holy word, our only source of absolute authority. Now, I would like us to go back in our minds to an episode that took place after the flood. You remember that when God created Adam and Eve, He told them to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. They were to disperse in the earth. The Bible tells us that because of the wickedness of the world, it was necessary for God to destroy the human race, and only Noah and his family were kept alive in the ark. Now, when Noah and his family came out of the ark, the Bible tells us that God once again gave them the same command that He had given to Adam and Eve. We find that command in Genesis chapter 9 and verses 1 and 2. Genesis 9, 1 and 2. This is as soon as they come out of the ark. Then God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, be fruitful and increase in number, and what? And fill the earth. So once again, they're told, don't gather in one place, multiply, scatter, and fill the earth. Don't consolidate into one single place. Now, there's a very important point that I need to bring to our minds, and that is that in the book of Genesis, as well as in the rest of the Bible, names are very important. More than 70 times in the book of Genesis alone, the importance of a significance of a name is given. Let me give you some examples. Peniel, which means face of God. The name Jacob means supplanter. He certainly lived in harmony with his character. When he overcame in his struggle with the angel, his name was changed to Israel, which means what? Prince of God. Abram was changed to Abraham. Sarai, which means laughter, is changed to Sarah. Yahweh Jireh, the Lord will provide, is the name given to the place where Abraham took Isaac, his son. And so we're going to find here in this story that we're going to study that there's a very important name that we are going to underline, and that is the word Babel, or the word Babel. Now, we need to remember a very important principle as we study this story of Genesis 11. And that is that in the Old Testament, we are dealing with a literal city, we are dealing with a literal valley, with literal builders of a literal tower on the banks of the literal Euphrates. But everything that is literal and local in Genesis 11 becomes universal, worldwide, and spiritual or symbolic at the end of time. That is the principle that we need to remember that will guide us in our study. So please go with me in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 11 and verses 1 and 2. Here we find what condition the people were in. This is taking place probably about 100 years after the flood. And it says there in Genesis 11 verses 1 and 2, now the whole earth had one language and one speech. Now this basically is saying that everybody spoke just one language. But there's something deeper here, and that is that these individuals not only spoke their one language, literally, but basically it means that they were all on the same page, if you please, because they could all communicate in this one language. And so it continues saying in verse 2, and it came to pass as they journeyed from the east. Probably a better translation is as they journeyed to the east. When you look at the geography of where the ark rested and where they built this tower, they journeyed to the east. And it says that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And of course, then they increase in numbers. And they don't want to disperse. They don't want to spread out across the earth the way that God had commanded them. What they wanted to do was build a tower and a city and consolidate and centralize everything. That project is described in Genesis 11 and verses 3 and 4. Notice the attitude that these Babel builders had when they undertook this special project. Then they said to one another, I'm reading in verse 3, come, let us. You're going to see several times they use the word us. This is a self-centered endeavor. They said to one another, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. They had brick for stone, and they had asphalt for mortar. And they said, come, let us build ourselves a city. This is an endeavor to glorify human beings, not to glorify God. It's in defiance against God, because God causes confusion. So it must have been wrong in the sight of God. So verse 4 says, and they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. We're going to see that that's important. And then once again, let us make a name for ourselves. In other words, let's become what? Famous. The founders want to be famous. So let us make a name for ourselves. And now notice what their concern is. They don't want to be scattered the way that God said. The last part of verse 4 says, lest we be what? Lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. Basically, this is the origin of the idea of a new world order centralized in one specific place. You see, they wanted to establish a new world order on the banks of the Euphrates River. Let me ask you, in the book of Revelation, is the Euphrates an important symbol that is used in connection with Babylon? Absolutely. So they wanted to establish this new world order on the banks of the Euphrates River, and their ideal was to save themselves while they still continued living a life of sin. They wanted to save themselves through their technological prowess. Now, there are two reasons why they built the tower. In Patriarchs and Prophets, page 120, we find those two reasons. By carrying the structure to a much greater height than was reached by the waters of the flood, they thought to, number one, place themselves beyond all possibility of danger. Let me ask you, had God said that He was not going to destroy the world with another flood? Yes. Was this a lack of faith? Yes. They did not trust God's promise. They distrusted God. They said, let's build a tower that is so high that it's much higher than the waters of the flood, so if another flood comes, we can save ourselves. Self-salvation characterizes Babylon. But there's a second reason. It continues saying, and as they would be able to ascend to the region of the clouds, this was no little old tower. This was like the Freedom Tower in New York, probably even higher than that, because they intended to reach the clouds. She says, and as they would be able to ascend to the region of the clouds, they hoped to ascertain the cause of the flood. Well, they should have known what the cause of the flood was. God said. So once again, they're distrusting God's word. Because God said, hey, I sent the flood because of the wickedness. They say, well, we're going to try and discover scientifically the reason of the flood. They put science above the Word of God, and they put their own salvation in place of the salvation of God. They distrust God's Word. And now we go to Genesis chapter 11 and verse 5. Was God observing what they were doing? Oh, you better believe God was watching. God now comes to investigate their project. It says in verse 5, but the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. Now, that expression, sons of men, is very interesting. When you go to Genesis chapter 6, you find that it says that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful. Who were the sons of God there in Genesis 6? It was the faithful, those who trusted God, those who were faithful to God. But who are the builders of the Tower of Babel? They are not the sons of God, they are the sons of men. Interesting variation between Genesis 6 and Genesis 11. Now, the Bible tells us that God keeps a record of nations. God keeps a record of human projects, and He will allow them to go only so far. Let me give you some examples. You remember that God told Abraham that the iniquity of the Amorites was not yet full. Was there a point at which the cup of God's justice reached its top and there would be no more mercy for the civilization where the Amorites lived? Absolutely. God kept a record of the Amorites. Let me ask you, did God keep a record of Jerusalem before it was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar? Yes. You remember in Ezekiel chapter 1, God comes on His chariot to the temple because He's going to do a work of investigation to see who's sighing and crying and who isn't. And once the sealing has taken place, probation is what? Probation is closed for Jerusalem. Let me ask you, did God do the same with Babylon? Did God weigh Babylon? He most certainly did. Remember the handwriting on the wall? You have been weighed in the balances, and you have been found wanting. See, God judges nations. And by the way, God judged also Jerusalem in the year 70. When they stoned Stephen, their door of probation was closed as a Jewish theocracy. Is there also going to be a declaration by God that the mercy has closed for the world before the second coming of Christ? You've read Revelation 22 verse 11 where it says, "He who is filthy, let him be filthy still. He who is unrighteous, let him be unrighteous still. He who is holy, let him be holy still. He who is righteous, let him be righteous still." At that moment, God is going to say, the world has reached its point of no return. There's no more mercy available. So does God keep a record of human projects and does not allow them to go beyond the line that He has established? Absolutely. So God comes down to see the tower that the sons of men are building. Ellen White, in Review and Herald, March 9, 1886, had something very interesting to say. God keeps a record with the nations. What does God do? He keeps a record with the nations. The figures are swelling against them in the books of heaven. And when it shall have become a law, speaking about the United States, that the transgression of the first day of the week shall be met with punishment, then their cup will be full. Is the cup of God's wrath going to be filled for this nation just like it became filled with all other nations? Absolutely. God keeps a record. He came down to see whether these individuals have gone beyond the point of no return. Now let's go to Genesis 11 verses 6 and 7. Here God is going to assess the situation and He's going to pronounce a verdict and the sentence based on His investigation. It says in verse 6, "And the Lord said, indeed, the people are" what? The people are one. What does that mean? They not only had one language, but they had one objective: to establish a global civilization centralized, that it was governed from one central place in rebellion against God. And so it says here that the people are one, and they all have one language. And this is what they begin to do. Oh, listen, this was only the beginning of what they planned to do. And God said, I'm not going to allow it to go any further. And then He continues saying, now nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them unless God intervenes, right? And so God says, come, let us go down and there confuse their language that they may not understand one another's speech. So God pronounces the verdict and the sentence that is going to be executed upon this rebellious endeavor of building the Tower of Babel. And so God now executes the sentence. And we find that in verses 8 and 9. Notice what God does. So the Lord scattered. Did they want to be scattered? No. God says, you're going to be what? You're going to be scattered. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the earth. And they ceased building the city. Therefore its name is called Babel, or Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. Now it's interesting to read Ellen White's enlightening comments about this episode of the Tower of Babel. So I'm going to read from Patriarchs and Prophets, pages 118 and 119. Speaking about the place where they wanted to build the city and the tower, here they decided to build a city, and in it a tower of such stupendous height as should render it the wonder of the world. These enterprises were designed to, listen carefully now, were designed to prevent the people from scattering abroad in colonies. God had directed men to disperse throughout the earth, to replenish and subdue it. But these Babel builders determined to keep their community united in one body. Is this going to happen in the book of Revelation? We studied it last time, right? There's going to be a union, a consolidation of the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. papists, Protestants, and worldlings, or the secular powers of the world. We noticed that in our last study. She continues writing, God had directed men to disperse throughout the earth to replenish and subdue it. But these Babel builders determined to keep their community united in one body and to found a monarchy. What is a monarchy? It's one ruler that rules the whole. So it says, and to found a monarchy that should eventually embrace the whole earth. Is this a new world order governed from one central place? Absolutely. Thus their city would become the metropolis of a universal empire. So this idea of a new world order is pretty old. It's nothing recent. So it continues saying, thus their city would become the metropolis of a universal empire. Its glory would command the admiration and homage of the world and render the founders illustrious. The magnificent tower reaching to the heavens was intended to stand as a monument of the power and wisdom of its builders, perpetuating their fame to the latest generations. The spirit of Babylon is a spirit of self-dependence and arrogance. It is a system that opposes God because it seeks to take the place of God. Notice later on, Nebuchadnezzar establishes what is known as the Neo-Babylonian Empire, or the New Babylonian Empire. And by the way, there is evidence that Nebuchadnezzar, when he established his empire, he was harking back to the original story in Genesis 11. And I want you to notice how Nebuchadnezzar spoke when he went out on the balcony of his palace and he observed the great city of Babylon. This is found in Daniel chapter 4 and verse 30. The king spoke, saying, is not this great Babylon that I have built for a royal dwelling by my mighty power for the honor of my majesty? So it is a system that depends on man. It is a system that is in rebellion against God and His Word. A system that distrusts what God says, that does not take the Bible as it reads. That's why people don't like the view of end-time events. They say, oh, that's a conspiration theory, because they can't understand what the Bible means when it says that there's going to be a nation that has two horns like a lamb, but it's going to speak like a dragon. It's going to contradict its own principles, in other words. Because they don't understand the prophecy, they don't really understand that this is not a conspirational view of history. This is a real view of prophecy and history. Now, was the confusion of the languages at Babel a wise thing? Yes, it was. It was a great blessing. You say, why is that? Because, folks, with a multinational, multilingual, and multicultural world, a global consolidated apostasy was made much more difficult. It was much more difficult to centralize everyone in rebellion against God, because everyone would have their own language, they would have their own nation, they would have their own culture, and they were dispersed over the earth depending on the language that they spoke. God designed, in other words, to forestall future united action that would demoralize the world shortly after the flood. Each of these groups that spoke a different language might pursue an evil course, but it would be very difficult for them all to unite in a concerted, united, universal opposition to God. But the interesting thing is that at the end of time, according to the book of Revelation, they are going to do it, at least for a short period of time. This was an empire built upon the greatness of man and in rebellion against God. And by the way, a unity based upon a human foundation will inevitably fall to pieces. And that's exactly what happened. God had the last word, and the result was division and confusion. God called that place Babel. Now the question is, are we going to meet Babel again in the Bible? Yes, we will meet Babel again in the book of Revelation. So must Genesis be the foundation of what we find in the book of Revelation? Yes, the name in Genesis gives us the origin of Babylon and its spirit. Revelation gives us the ending point, the Babylon of the end of time. By the way, it's interesting to notice that these days many individuals are speaking about the need for a new world order. In our last presentation, I read some statements from a Jesuit scholar of the Roman Catholic Church. Actually, many people don't realize this, but Malachi Martin was also an exorcist. He called that his special gift. And he died under circumstances that are uncertain, why he died the way that he did. There's uncertainty there. And I believe it's because he wrote a book called The Jesuits, and because he wrote the book, The Keys of This Blood, where he clearly revealed as early as 1990 what is happening in the world today. And it's not because he's a prophet, but it's because he's a member of the Jesuits. Ellen White says that the papacy can see ahead based on what has taken place in the past. In other words, because they are so experienced, 2,000 years of experience, they can predict what's going to happen pretty well, even though it's not really a prophecy. It's just saying what's going to happen on the basis of what has happened before. Now, I'd like to read, once again, the statement that I read in our last presentation by Malachi Martin. This was in 1990 in his book, The Keys of This Blood. You remember that this book describes a tooth and nail struggle among three powers. Number one, the Roman Catholic papacy. Number two, capitalist nations of the West, which are composed mostly of Protestants. And in the third place, the secular communists, or those who are unchurched. You can refer to them in many different ways. And his idea is that the struggle among these three could only be won by one of these systems. And guess which system it is? Well, let's read what he has to say. In his book, Keys of This Blood, page 18, he states this, and I quote, "There is one great similarity shared by all three of these globalist competitors." Gorbachev, at that time John Paul II, and in the capitalist West, Ronald Reagan. Those were the three competitors, but they represent systems. So there is one great similarity shared by all three of these globalist competitors. Each one has in mind a particular grand design for one world governance. Now you'll find many, many times in this book, The Keys of This Blood, the expression grand design. Now you notice here what the grand design is. The grand design is what? One world governance from a centralized place. And where is that place? It's in Vatican City, folks. It's not in New York. It's in Vatican City. And so he continues writing, there, that is these three, their geopolitical competition is about which of the three, writing in 1990, which of the three will form, dominate, and run the world system that will replace the decaying nation system. The idea is to get rid of the idea of independent nations, all having their own laws, all doing their own thing. And the idea is to unite everyone with international laws, international rules, governed from one central location. Is this just like what happened at the Tower of Babel? It's just the same thing that happened at the Tower of Babel. So he says, the struggle among these three is to find out who will form, dominate, and run the world system that will replace the decaying nation system. By the way, Martin harbors no doubts about who will win this tooth and nail competition. And that's the Roman Catholic Church. And the reason he says that there's no doubt that the papacy is going to win is because Jesus gave Peter the keys to the kingdom, and Jesus said, Peter, upon you, and of course Jesus wasn't speaking about Peter, he's speaking about himself, but they say that Jesus said to Peter, you are the rock, and upon you I'm going to build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And so God has predicted, according to his interpretation of Matthew chapter 16, that the papacy cannot fail, that it is going to be the winner in this competition. In chilling words, Malachi Martin had this to say about all of the things that characterize society. Page 16 of his book, No Holds Barred. Because once the competition has been decided, the world and all that is in it, our way of life as individuals and as citizens of the nations, our families and our jobs, our trade and commerce and money, our educational systems and our religions and our cultures, even the badges of our national identity, which most of us have always taken for granted, all will have been powerfully and radically altered forever. Did you notice that he's saying that everything in society, everything in the nations is going to be thrown upside down? And then he continues writing, no one can be exempted from its effects. No sector of our lives will remain untouched. Nobody who is acquainted with the plans of these three rivals has any doubt, but that only one of them can win. Are we seeing the individual who is claiming to be the winner now? You better believe it. This was written back in 1990, and it's happening right before our eyes. You know, I went to Philadelphia when the Pope came there. It was an amazing sight. More than 1 million people rendering him honor, almost like he was God on earth. Would that have happened back in the days of John F. Kennedy? Would that have happened even before that? No way. John F. Kennedy had to go to Houston to speak to the Ministerial Association and say, hey, I'm going to respect the United States Constitution. I'm going to take my orders from the Constitution, not from the Pope. But these days, things have changed radically. Now let's go in our Bibles to the end time scenario in the book of Revelation. We've noticed what Genesis has to say. Now let's go to the book of Revelation, chapter 17 and verses 1 through 6. Revelation 17, 1 through 6. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and talked with me, saying to me, come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot. Now let's stop there for a moment. What does a woman represent in Bible prophecy? A woman represents a church. If it's a pure woman, it represents God's true church. If it is a harlot woman or a prostitute, it represents a church that is living in adultery. In other words, that has forsaken Jesus as her husband. And so this is an apostate church. So it says, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters. What does the act of sitting mean? It means that she is what? She's ruling over the waters. And what do the waters represent? You've read the verse 15. It says multitudes, nations, tongues, and peoples. She rules over the whole what? Over the whole world from one central place. Was that the ideal of the Babel builders? It most certainly was. But she's not alone with the multitudes, because it continues saying in verse 2, with whom the what? The kings of the earth committed fornication. So who else is allied with her? Not only the multitudes, but the what? The political powers of the world, the kings of the earth. Does that ring a bell when you have the Pope giving a speech before 193 representatives of 193 nations, and all of them giving him a standing ovation when he spoke about the need to address world poverty and climate change? I'll tell you what, it's like you've seen this fulfilled right before your eyes. So it continues saying, with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. Her wine are her false doctrines, her false teachings. Oh, but that doesn't end there, because it says in verse 5, and on her forehead a name was written. What is her name? Does this take us back to the idea in Genesis? Is it the same name? So if it's the same name, must it be the same character? Absolutely, because the name is an indication of the character. So it says, on her forehead a name was written, Mystery, Babylon the Great. And then it says the what? The mother of harlots. Oh, so now we have another group that is involved. How many of you have ever seen a mother that does not have children? I've seen women that don't have children, but I've never seen the first mother that doesn't have children. So let me ask you, does this harlot have children or daughters that were born from her? Yes, because these are woman harlots, according to the context. So at some point in her history, later on in her history, there were children born from her that share many of the same ideas that the mother has. Kind of like the story of Herodias and Salome. Like mother, like what? Like daughter. I'm not going to get into that story. That's a prophetic story. But anyway, you see this union here. The great harlot, the multitudes, the kings of the earth, the daughters. Let me ask you, which churches were born from the Roman Catholic papacy that have many of her teachings and practices? Protestants, that's right. But that's not it. That's not it. Notice, there's more. It says in, once again, verse 5, and on her forehead a name was written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I marveled with great amazement. But you know, there's another group that the Bible says are going to join with her. The merchants of the earth. See, you have to go to Revelation 18. In our prayer meeting, we studied Revelation 18 in detail. Louis knows because Louis has been there for practically every prayer meeting. But the merchants of the earth, in other words, the world economy is also going to cooperate with this Babylonian system. Notice Revelation chapter 18 and verse 3, where we find that. It says, For all nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. The kings of the earth have committed fornication with her. And listen carefully, and the merchants of the earth have become rich through the abundance of her luxury. So what do you have? What picture do you have here in Revelation 17? You have a global system. You have an apostate church, the daughters, the multitudes, the kings of the earth, those who handle the economy, the merchants of the earth, all gathering together in a global system against God. And in Revelation 17 and verse 13 it says that these will be of one mind. Remember the story of the Tower of Babel? These will be of one mind, and they will give their power and authority to the beast. Do you think God is watching what's happening with Babylon? Do you think God is attentive to what is taking place? Is God examining what is taking place? Oh yes. Who is going to have the last word? Are God's people going to be persecuted at the end time by this system because they don't want to comply? They don't want to join the New World Order? Absolutely. But God will have the last word, and confusion of Babylon will be the result. Let's read about it. In the seventh plague, Revelation chapter 16, verses 17 to 21. Revelation 16, verses 17 to 21. It says, Then the seventh angel poured out his bowl into the air, and a loud voice came out of the temple of heaven from the throne, saying, It is done. And there were noises and thunderings and lightnings, and there was a great earthquake, such a mighty and great earthquake as had not occurred since men were on the earth. Now the great city was divided into three parts. Was there division at the Tower of Babel? Yes. But you see, the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet were all what? They were all united. But when Babylon falls, they're going to what? They're going to be divided, just like at Babel. So it says, Now the great city was divided into three parts, and the cities of the nations fell, and great Babylon was remembered before God to give her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath. Then every island fled away, and the mountains were not found, and great hail from heaven fell upon men, each hailstone about the weight of a talent. And men blasphemed God because of the plague of the hail, since that plague was exceedingly great. Babylon will fall. Babylon will be divided, and the same sentence that was pronounced at the tower and the city will take place once again, not in a literal valley with a literal tower with literal builders in a literal city, but with a worldwide global system. You know, today in the world, the catchword is globalism. Let me just share some of the details of this global perspective that is being spoken about. Let me ask you, do we have a one world when it comes to travel? You know, I travel mostly on American Airlines. Do you know what their alliance is called? The One World Alliance. Interesting. You can travel anywhere in the planet and be there on the same day, or at least a few hours the next day. So world travel has drawn the world together. Let me ask you, is there somewhat of a global language? You know, you can find software that can translate things instantly in an intelligible manner. Man has overcome the barrier of language, hasn't he? How about a one-world economy? You know, it's said that when the United States sneezes, the world catches cold. Well, guess what? Now when the world sneezes, the United States also catches cold, because there is actually a global economy that is interconnected. Let me ask you, is there a one-world technology? There most certainly is. We talk about drones and satellites, the internet, and so on. Brings the world together. You know, I can't cease to be amazed that I can sit at my computer and I can talk by Skype with somebody that is in China. It's unbelievable that you could do that. I still remember when you had to send telegraphs at Western Union, and you were really economical with the words. You know, you wouldn't say, I will arrive tomorrow at such and such. Arrive tomorrow, 3. You know, because it was charged by words. You say, well, you've revealed your age. Well, maybe so. But the world has changed. Technology has joined the world together. Let me ask you, do we live in a world of global communication? Yes. Skype, email, Twitter, Facebook, cell phones have created an environment where the whole world is like a neighborhood. Do we have a one-world marketplace? Absolutely. These great trade agreements, NAFTA, CAFTA, the Trans-Pacific, which by the way was signed recently, and it includes 40% of the nations of the world joined in this endeavor. Have we had mega mergers of huge corporations? Absolutely. You know, there's only 3 major airlines left in the United States of America: Delta, United, and American Airlines. American Airlines just merged with US Air. And so all of the great corporations are also consolidating and coming together. Are people talking about the need for religious harmony? Do you know that Shimon Peres, who was the prime minister of Israel, suggested that it would be good to establish a United Nations of religion, with the Pope presiding as the head of that religious organization, and he is a Jew? Is the world coming together politically and militarily to face the common enemy, radical Islam? Absolutely. In fact, when I was in England, you had this attack in San Bernardino, and next day in the newspaper it says, "World powers ally themselves against ISIS." And for the first time that I can remember, the Security Council of the United Nations voted 15-0 to all come together in fighting against ISIS. Even Russia and China came on board, which is practically unheard of. Let me ask you, is the issue of climate change bringing the whole world together? Absolutely. How about the issue of addressing world poverty? The need to save the nucleus of the family? Absolutely. In fact, in Paris, 193 nations signed this agreement to eradicate poverty and to eradicate the problems of climate change by the year 2030. Do we live in a world also that has a one-world philosophy? Absolutely. Postmodern thinking. There's no absolutes. The talking of tolerance, political correctness, unity and diversity, pluralism, human rights. By the way, I believe in human rights, but let me say that doing evil is not a human right. Is it? You know, God allows people to choose evil, but it's not a human right in the sight of God. Ellen White predicted that the whole world would come together in the end time. In the book Last Day Events, page 136, she stated this: the so-called Christian world, notice the so-called. The so-called Christian world is to be the theater of great and decisive actions. Men in authority will enact laws. Where? In the Christian world, right? Will enact laws controlling the conscience after the example of the papacy. And now notice, Babylon will make all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. Every nation will be involved. Is that similar to what we found at the Tower of Babel? Everybody coming together? Every nation will be involved. These have one mind. She's quoting the text from Revelation 17, verse 13. There will be a universal union, bond of union, one great harmony, a confederacy of Satan's forces. But folks, it is a union based on error. It is a union based on human rebellion against God. It is a union based on the theory of evolution, which robs God of His love and His greatness. It is a union based on the idea that gay marriage is as acceptable as heterosexual marriage. It is a union based on the idea that there needs to be a millennium of peace, not in heaven, but a millennium of peace where? A millennium of peace on earth. It is a union that will say that Sunday is the day that the whole world needs to keep. It will be a union based on error, and a union based on error is doomed to fall. Now let's go back to Ben Carson, with whom we began our study. You know, minority organizations today that are sectarian, considered sectarian, and critical of the sinfulness of the world will eventually be looked down upon as being divisive, as being troublers of the people, and they eventually will be proscribed. You say, that could never happen in the United States of America, the land of the free and the home of the brave. Well, there is a beast that has two horns like a lamb, but at the same time, it will speak like a dragon. And that nation represents the United States. So what about Ben Carson? You know, he might not win in this cycle. It doesn't look like it. But the main point has been established, and that is that once the media picks up on the view of end-time events of Seventh-day Adventists, they will be considered conspirationists, to use the word that is used by David Korn in his article. They will be considered dangerous and divisive. Ellen White, in the book Fundamentals of Christian Education, page 289, and I read this one last night, she says, when we reach the standard that the Lord would have us reach, worldlings will regard Seventh-day Adventists as odd, singular, straight-laced extremists. Why don't they look at us that way today? She says, when we reach the standard that the Lord would have us reach. That's the reason why. And then she says, she gives a Bible verse for this, we are made a spectacle unto the world and to angels and to men. Volume 5 of the Testimonies, page 546, Ellen White wrote, our people have been regarded as too insignificant to be worthy of notice. But a change will come. The Christian world is now making movements which will necessarily bring commandment-keeping people into prominence. That's where David Korn's blog comes in, as well as the Young Turks. The mainstream media has not picked up on it, but believe me, if Ben Carson was higher in the polls, eventually the mainstream media would pick up on this view of eschatology as well. You know, Ellen White wrote something that would appear absurd, that would appear never to be able to happen. In Great Controversy, page 592, she wrote this very significant statement. Those who honor the Bible Sabbath will be denounced as enemies of law and order. Wow. Say, can that be true? Absolutely. Those who honor the Bible Sabbath will be denounced as enemies of law and order, as breaking down the moral restraints of society, causing anarchy and corruption, and calling down the judgments of God upon the earth. Remember the days of Elijah? Did that happen in the days of Elijah? Did the king say, oh, you troubler of the people, you're the one that has brought this calamity upon us? And what did Elijah say? Oh, cool off now, king. That's not what he said. He said, you and your father's house have brought this upon because you have forsaken the commandments of God and you're worshiping Baal, the sun god. She continues writing, their conscientious scruples, that is of the remnant, will be pronounced obstinacy, stubbornness, and contempt of authority. They will be accused of disaffection toward the government because the government will give a law, Sunday law. So if you don't keep the Sunday law, they'll say, oh, you're disaffected with the government. She continues writing, ministers who deny the obligation of the divine law will present from the pulpit the duty of yielding obedience to the civil authorities as ordained of God. In legislative halls and courts of justice, commandment keepers will be misrepresented and condemned. A false coloring will be given to their words. The worst construction will be put upon their motives. And it makes you wonder what David Corn will say when these things start happening. Say, wow, maybe Ben Carson was right. She continues writing, as the Protestant churches reject the clear scriptural arguments in defense of God's law, they will long to silence those whose faith they cannot overthrow by the Bible. Though they blind their own eyes to the fact, they are now adopting a course which will lead to the persecution of those who conscientiously refuse to do what the rest of the Christian world are doing and acknowledge the claims of the papal Sabbath. She finishes the statement by saying, the dignitaries of church and state will unite to bribe, persuade, or compel all classes to honor Sunday. The lack of divine authority will be supplied by oppressive enactments. And then she says this, political corruption is destroying love of justice and regard for truth. Is that true today? Political corruption? Oh, I don't even need to say anymore. She writes, political corruption is destroying love of justice and regard for truth. And even in free America, rulers and legislators, in order to secure public favor, that means in order to secure votes, will yield to the popular demand for a law enforcing Sunday observance. Liberty of conscience, which has cost so great a sacrifice, will no longer be respected. In the soon coming conflict, we shall see exemplified the prophet's words, the dragon was wroth with the woman and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. The history of the papacy will be repeated on a global scale. That's what prophecy says is going to happen. So let me ask you, what should God's people be doing while this is happening in the world? The whole world is coming together. The dragon, the beast, and the false prophet, the multitudes, the merchants, they're all coming together in this global system. They're all on the same page. What should God's people be doing? We should also be coming together, right? Why do you suppose the devil is trying to do everything in his power to divide the Seventh-day Adventist Church? Especially doctrinally. It's because he knows that if he can divide God's army and he can unite his, he wins. But we cannot allow him to do that. While he unites his army, God's people need to unite on the Lord's side. In John 17, verses 14 through 19, we find on what basis God's people are to unite. See, because it's not just like the world says, oh, let's just all join together and get along. It doesn't matter what religion you are, what you believe, what you practice, let's just all agree to disagree. Let's just ride off into the sunset and sing Kumbaya, my Lord, and we'll all get along, we'll be fine. No, that's not the basis for unity. The basis for unity is God's truth. Here's what Jesus said in John 17, 14 through 19. Speaking to his Father about his disciples, I have given them your word. What did Jesus give to the disciples? The word. And the world has hated them because they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. So when you have the word, is the world going to hate you? Yes. Jesus continued saying, I do not pray that you should take them out of the world. It's not like we should isolate ourselves from the world, but that you should keep them from the evil one. They are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. And then he says on what basis God's people are to come together. Sanctify them by your truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, I also have sent them into the world, and for their sakes I sanctify myself, that they also may be sanctified by what? May be sanctified by the truth. How important is God's word? How important is truth in the unity of God's people? It is indispensable because any building that is built on error will fall. You remember the story of the man who built his house upon the rock? And the storms came, the winds blew, the floods came, and the house stood because it was built upon the rock. But then you have the house that was built on the sand. By the way, that's human tradition. Because at the end of the parable, Jesus says that the multitudes were impressed by his teaching because he taught with authority and not like the scribes. In other words, he didn't teach on the basis of tradition, he taught on the basis of God's holy word. Ellen White, in Bible Echo, September 1st, 1888, in the heat of the Sunday law crisis back in the 1880s, wrote this: Christ is leading out a people to stand in perfect unity on the broad platform of eternal truth. I love that statement. I'm going to read it again. Christ is leading out a people to stand in perfect unity on the broad platform of what? Of eternal truth. You know what is in line is going to happen in the United States is really saddening. In Review and Herald, May 2, 1893, Ellen White explains, the people of the United States have been a favored people. Would we agree with that? Everybody wants to come to the U.S. You know, that's why you have zillions of immigrants wanting to come to this country. The people of the United States have been a favored people. But listen, now notice. But when they restrict religious liberty, surrender Protestantism, and give countenance to popery, the measure of their guilt will be full. Did the measure of the guilt of the Tower of Babel come to its conclusion? Yes. She says, the measure of their guilt will be full, and now listen to this, and national apostasy will be registered in the books of heaven. The result of this apostasy will be national ruin. Yesterday I talked about the issue of climate change, poverty, and family. You know, those are the three main points that the papacy is emphasizing these days. And the Pope has gone on record saying that they're all related to Sunday. Family, for example. Oh, you know, the family needs one day where they can just don't have to go to work, they can go to Mass and they can become spiritually enriched. And guess what day that is? Sunday. And then he says, you know, in order to solve the problem of poverty, oh, poor people, they're so overworked. You know, the capitalists have made them work so hard. So the capitalists need to give them one day where the worker can take off and just kind of unwind. And guess what day that is? Sunday. And then he says climate change. You know, we need to let the environment of the world rest. By the way, he's written on this. I have quotations in the article I wrote for the newsletter. There, it's all there. I hope that you'll read that article. Reflections on the Pope's agenda. It's all documented there. He says we need to give the environment, we need to give the world of nature a rest once a week. And guess what day it is? Sunday. Last I knew in Genesis it says that the Sabbath is the day that we're supposed to let nature rest, because it's the day that God rested from all his labors. You know, and the explanation that is given for climate change, you know, they say climate change is caused by fossil fuels and it's caused by cutting down forests. Well, that might be involved, but that's not the real reason. Let me read you a statement that I read in my last presentation. Volume 6 of the Testimonies, page 408. Ellen White wrote, the restraining spirit of God is even now being withdrawn from the world. Hurricanes, storms, tempests, fire, and flood. Boy, she says like she's writing today, right? Yep. Disasters by sea and land follow each other in quick succession. Now, notice what the result is, what the explanation is by the world of science. She says science seeks to explain all these. The signs thickening around us, telling us of the near approach of the Son of God, are attributed to any other than the true cause. Men cannot discern the sentinel angels restraining the four winds, that they shall not blow until the servants of God are sealed. But when God shall bid his angels loose the winds, there will be such a scene of strife as no pen can picture. Isn't that an amazing statement? You know, there's a time of trouble coming, folks, and it is the worst time of trouble in the history of the world. We can imagine the worst, and it's still going to be worse than what we can imagine. And you say, wow, that's depressing. I hope the Lord lays me to rest before that. You know, I hear many Adventists say, you know, I hope the Lord lays me to rest before the time of trouble. I'll tell you, I say, I hope the Lord keeps me alive, because I want to be part of that movement, proclaiming the loud cry of Revelation chapter 18. No matter what persecution and how many problems come, I want to have the privilege of uplifting the truth of God. So let's not say, I hope the Lord lays me to rest in times of peace. So then I'll enjoy my cake here, and you know, and I'll have my cake and I'll eat it too. Now let me finish by reading you the real reason why everything is going to fall apart. Isaiah 24 describes the second coming of Jesus in vivid terms. You can read it in the first 6 verses. Verse 5 is a critical verse. It gives us 3 reasons why the world is going to be destroyed. And none of them are global warming or climate change. None of them are poverty or the disintegration of the family. These are all symptoms, but there's a disease behind the symptoms. Notice what it says in Isaiah 24, verse 5. The earth also is defiled under the inhabitants thereof. What is the earth? It's what? Defiled under the inhabitants. Why is it defiled? Listen, because they have transgressed the laws, changed the ordinance. You know, I have a sermon titled, Changing the Ordinance. It's connected with Daniel 7:25. He shall think to change times and law. Let me ask you, which were the 2 ordinances that God established at creation? Marriage and the Sabbath. Is there a frontal attack against marriage today? Yes, legalized by the Supreme Court of the United States. Is the Sabbath going to be next? The devil has softened people up for the next great fight. So 3 reasons: because they have transgressed the laws, changed the ordinance, and broken the everlasting covenant. 3 reasons, interrelated, why the world is going to fall apart. But the good news is that even though the Bible presents a depressing scenario of the end time, and by the way, it is a very distressing scenario. You know, parents will deliver their children to death according to Jesus. You know, workers will rise against their overlords according to James chapter 5. The capitalist system will fall apart. There will be epidemics, and there will be hunger, and there will be earthquakes and terrible disasters. The Bible says that things are going to get worse and worse and worse and worse, and the world will only have one hope, and that is that Jesus will come and he will establish a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, a kingdom of peace founded upon the truth of God's holy word. I want to end by reading Isaiah chapter 9 and verses 6 and 7. We usually read verse 6, but we forget to read verse 7. No, verse 6 speaks about the incarnation of Christ. Verse 7 speaks about what the result of his incarnation is going to be. Because he became incarnate, he is going to be able to establish his everlasting kingdom. If he had not come the first time, he will not be able to come the second time. Notice what it says there in Isaiah 9. We'll read verse 2 and then verses 6 and 7. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in the land of the shadow of death, upon them a light has shined. And then comes the famous verse, for unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulder. So notice the tense of the verbs. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government will be, future, and the government will be upon his shoulder, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. And now notice verse 7, the consequence of the increase of his government and peace, there will be no end. Upon the throne of David and over his kingdom, to order it and establish it with judgment and justice, from that time forward, even forever, the zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this. Is that what we're looking forward to? folks, you know, yesterday we were talking about what a worldling is. A worldling is an individual who is focused on the here and now, on their houses, on their money, on their entertainment, on their stocks and bonds. Their whole focus is the here and now, and not the sweet by and by. God calls upon us to think differently, to have our eyes focused upon heaven, our eyes focused upon Jesus, to keep everything we are and everything we have in perspective. You know the little chorus, turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full in His wonderful face. And what happens as a result? The things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of His glory and grace. May the Lord bless us and help us to have that perspective. Let us pray. Father in heaven, we thank You for revealing the end from the beginning. Thank You that even though the end time scenario is depressing, it ends with the glorious coming of Jesus on a very positive note. We look forward to the day when Jesus will come. We're tired of living in this world of sin and sorrow and sickness and suffering and death. We want to go home. I ask, Lord, that You will keep us faithful to You in the trying times ahead. Use us as Your instruments to proclaim Your message boldly and without fear. I ask that You will bless all of those who are watching this live streaming, those who will watch the DVD and also on YouTube. I ask, Lord, that You will lead them to make a decision to be on Your side, on the side of Your remnant. Thank You, Father, for hearing our prayer, for we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.